Hello, everybody. Today we're going to jump into Unit 6, Day 5, and start talking about Gilded Age politics. And you're going to see this is the first of a couple days where we will be talking about politics during the Gilded Age and what that actually looked like. So this is known as the era of the politics of status quo. So why was it called that? Politics from 1877 to 1893. You're going to see that during this time that you're not going to really have any great leaders emerge. Most people know very little about the presidents from 1877 to 1893 because it is considered that era of forgettable presidents. Political leaders would attempt to restrain national power during this time to core services, and many were unhappy with the federal government's new responsibilities that it picked up during the Civil War and wanted to move away from that. You'll see here's a list of the presidents during this time. Again, none of them very remarkable or notable for most people throughout history. James A. Garfield, probably the most memorable of them all because he was assassinated. Even today, if you ask people to list the presidents that were assassinated, they probably couldn't tell you that Garfield had been assassinated. And you'll see here's a video about the assassination of Garfield because it will actually have an effect on politics of the day. If you ever have a chance, I encourage you to go to Cleveland and visit Lakeview Cemetery, which is where he is buried. It is absolutely the most beautiful, I don't know what you would call it, a beautiful monument to him within this big building there where he is buried. So why are none of the presidents during this era very memorable? So during this time, really the president's most demanding task was dispensing patronage to supporters, which meant giving out jobs and that kind of thing. This would be reformed, though, after the assassination of President Garfield by Charles Guiteau. Why did that happen? Really, the reason Guiteau killed Garfield was because he was angry that Garfield didn't give him a job that he felt like he deserved. In the end, though, Guiteau was actually just insane, and they think actually syphilis had caused him to start going crazy. So with that, in the assassination of Garfield, you would see the Pendleton Act in 1883, which established a civil service commission to fill federal jobs by examination. So now it was made so that no longer were you just was a president giving out patronage jobs to whoever who had supported him, but they were trying to get the most qualified people into that job. It would originally only cover 10% of the jobs. It would eventually be expanded. Now, what effect would this have on the presidency? Well, basically, it makes the president even more useless during this time because now he doesn't have the patronage to give out. So what does the president really do? The federal government during this time, you're going to see White House staff was relatively small. Congress had primary control over the budget, which is actually the role of Congress to do that. Federal agencies, though, would pay more attention to congressional committees than they would to the Congress or to the president. Federal funds came from customs duties and excess taxes on liquor and tobacco. And the pressing question was how to reduce the budget surplus during that time. Now, you have lived your whole life, and I have lived my whole life in an era of there's always a budget deficit, which means the government is spending more money than it is bringing in. During this time period, you're going to see the government is spending less money than it's bringing in. So the question is, what do we do with all this extra money? And you are going to see the majority of federal employees would work for the post office, and most important cabinet offices carried out routine duties. So you kind of think when you look at government at this time, it's kind of ho-hum, not a ton happening. Also, presidents during this time, they viewed the presidency as purely executive in nature, which again, a lot of people would argue, well, that's the role of the president, to be executive in nature and not to be like a king. And so with that meant that the party leaders in Congress were very, very important, and they saw themselves as an equal to the president. And again, if you think about it, we have balance of power between the different branches, so that's how things should be. So you would see leaders such as Roscoe Conkling, who is pictured here, would stand up to President Hayes and Garfield, and they didn't have a problem doing that. Again, because they saw themselves as an equal. Woodrow Wilson, when talking about this era, if you don't know about Woodrow Wilson, later president, he would be president during World War I. He was also a college professor and a very, very intelligent guy. He would, again, call this the era of congressional government. Congress was often bogged down by procedures and factions during this time, but you will see that during this time, differences between the parties became very, very muddled, and that's going to be reflected in the elections, and that parties generally generally agreed on a lot of different things. Usually during this time, you're going to see most of your issues are going to be divisions from within the party. So again, during this time, Congress has a whole lot of power. Now, tariffs. Tariffs still would be a big issue. Remember, tariffs have been an issue basically since the beginning of the country. High tariffs have been in place since Abraham Lincoln was president. Democrats attacked the Republican protectionism and said, hey, we should do something about this. But you will see that despite the differences, Congress often vote in their constituents' interests, which meant if a tariff was good for their constituents, they were going to vote for that. Grover Cleveland, when he ran for president, he would actually campaign on tariff reduction. His defeat, though, by McKinley would be the end of that because McKinley would put in place a tariff that raised tariffs to 49.5%, which is absolutely massive as far as tariffs go. And again, because of things during this era being so close and because of things being the parties being so similar, you're going to see that both of the parties are very, very cautious about how they go about things. Neither one of the sides wanted to say something that was going to alienate voters during that day. Now, you see today, our politicians still have a similar mindset, but our politicians today kind of try to cater to their base, which is at the far of either fringe of the party. And that is the complete opposite during this time. They were trying to cater towards that very big moderate group within the electorate of the U.S. society. Republicans during this time would continue to do what they had done since the Civil War, which was wave the bloody shirt against the Democrats, blaming them for the Civil War. Civil War issues would also pop up, such as pensions for veterans and their wives. That would be something that would constantly come up during this time. This right here, this is from the election of 1888, but you're going to see this is typical of election maps from 1877 to 92. If you look at the popular vote there, very, very close, about 100,000 votes separate them. And that, again, is going to be how you're going to see pretty much every election during this time. They're going to be very, very close. And again, showing just how the society was at that time and how politicians were and government in general. Now, campaigns were something that people did take a lot of interest in during this time. Probably the election of 1884, the most memorable of them of all. You got the tagline, "Maul, Maul, where's my paw?" There were criticisms of Grover Cleveland, people saying that he had an illegitimate child. Also, you would see this idea of Romanism and rebellion. This was a claim by Republican clergymen regarding Democrats, and this would have alienated Catholic voters during that time. You will see, though, that during this time, people take a lot of interest in campaigns, and you get these taglines and that kind of thing that come out because people do have so much interest in these presidential campaigns. Again, we've mentioned laissez-faire before, but the belief that less government interference, the better economically, and this would be prevalent throughout this time period. President Cleveland, showing a very laissez-faire type attitude, said, though the government support the people should not support the government. Or the government should not support the people. Again, showing this idea that government really should have their hands off and stay out of society as much as possible. The courts. So from the 1870s on, you're going to see the courts increasingly would try to protect the private property rights from the government. Courts were most often challenged by states due to the residual powers of social welfare and economic regulation being left to the states. So again, a lot of these things today that within our government are functions of the federal government, such as like food stamps and other social welfare programs. During this time, states handled that. States, though, much like the federal government during this time, were cutting expenditures and public services. So a key question that you would have is, how do courts balance the state's police powers to defend the general welfare against the liberty of individuals to pursue private interests? So they're trying to come up with this balance of basically how to balance power, how to defend general welfare, but also giving people freedom, especially in a business sense, freedom to be able to do what they need to do to make money or whatever it might be. Also, the 14th Amendment, we talked about the 14th Amendment at the end of the Civil War, which gave equal rights to African Americans. And now you're going to see the 14th Amendment start to be interpreted in a little bit of a different way. Within the 14th Amendment, you have the Due Process Clause, again, originally protected or created to protect former slaves. This would also be used to protect property rights and liberty of any person, including corporations, because legally corporations are defined as a person. So then the 14th Amendment, as a result of this interpretation of it, was then used to restrain state power to regulate private business. So again, you have the courts stepping in to restrain states and keep them from going after private business. The Supreme Court would also use this to restrain the federal government as well. Basically, again, going with this attitude of government needs to have their hands out of business as much as possible. So what does this all mean? You're going to see the judiciary had the most power during this age of enterprise because really they could step in and kind of control and rein in Congress if they needed to. Many Americans, much like today, looked down on politicians, but they held the court in very high esteem. And again, a lot of people view that way about the court as well. I think that goes to the function of the court not being an elected body, so they are not involved in politics. Their function is to look at and to uphold the law. Individualism. We've talked about this going back to transcendentalism, but the ideology of individualism would grow during the age of enterprise. The thought was, again, this idea that any man, however humble, could rise as far as his talents would carry him. So this idea of the self-made man, and that if you really wanted to, you could accomplish a lot by putting your mind to it and using your talents to take you, make you, maybe become wealthy and that kind of thing. And people like this idea because they viewed it as the success of an individual contributed to the progress of society as a whole. So rag to riches stories during this time were very, very popular. What about politics and the people? As I mentioned, voting during this time, you're going to see more voters turned out in presidential elections than any other time in history, which you kind of find interesting since politics seems like it was really boring during this time, but people did have a lot of interest in it. Democrats and Republicans were often loyal for life. National conventions would attract huge crowds. You would see party paraphernalia become very, very common. Again, this is something we're very used today. We're used to seeing campaign signs, and in this election season, seeing like Trump flags and all kinds of different party paraphernalia, shirts, and all that sort of thing. But during this time, this is when this really, really grew in popularity. Actually, you would have candidates featured on baseball cards and that kind of stuff. So again, the people had this big interest in politics. You would say, why were they so interested in politics? Well, if you think about it, a lot of people didn't have anything else to do to be super interested in, and this was something that they could be interested in. So what do the parties look like during this time? You're going to see that Democrats, typically Southerners and immigrants. Northern Democrats were often foreign-born and Catholic, Lutheran, or Jewish. Big city political machines tended to lean towards the Democratic Party, and the Democrats were for states' rights and limiting the powers of the federal government. So you can say, going back to like your Jacksonian-style Democrat of pushing for states' rights and limiting the federal government, that's where the Democratic Party still was during this time. The Republicans, often native-born, Protestant, and middle class, they were pro-business and high tariff, believed in the power of the state to uphold moral values and regulate personal values. So they would be the party that would support temperance during this time, which is the movement to get rid of alcohol. And African Americans during this time would still support the Republican Party as well, because that was the party of Lincoln, and that's why you're going to see a lot of African American support for them. Education. The question was, should instruction in public schools be in English? Again, think about all the immigrants that you have coming in to the country during this time. A lot of immigrant groups wanted their children taught in their own languages, but a lot of Americans felt like the education should be in English. You also had a question over how religious schools should be treated. Catholics fought a losing battle over public aid for parochial schools, which basically meant public aid for Catholic schools. In some areas, such as Boston, where you had a lot of Irish coming in there, you did have anti-Catholic pushback and some anti-Catholic textbooks during that time as well. So again, more questions about how what the country would look like as a result of all this immigration. Now, as far as public schools went, you would see that new compulsory education laws required students to attend school. And as a result of that, you're going to see by 1900s, 90% of the population was literate. And we kind of take this for granted, the idea that almost everybody within our society can read. But previous to this, you had a good portion of the society during this time that could not read. So getting these literacy rates to 90% is quite the accomplishment. Tax-supported public high schools would become more popular as well, and you would see the McGuffey reader would still be very, very popular in elementary schools. There's a picture of that, and that had been used for a very long time within U.S. history. Colleges and universities, you're going to see the number of colleges increase as a result of land grant colleges. Basically, what these would do, these wealthy philanthropists would found colleges. Also, you would have these new colleges for women, but the government got in on this and helped by giving colleges land to be able to create their colleges during this time. Johns Hopkins University would be founded in Baltimore, Maryland, as the first American institute to specialize in advanced graduate studies. And you're going to see, because of the growth of these colleges within the United States, that U.S. students begin to be able to compete with those from Europe. Before this, you would see a lot of people viewed it as like that U.S. colleges couldn't compete with like an Oxford University and those places. But during this time, as you start to see the number of colleges improve, the quality of education at these improves, you start to see the U.S. being able to compete with that as well. Blue laws and alcohol. And again, we talked about the Republicans, how they viewed that the government, it was their role to regulate certain personal behaviors. And basically what a blue law is these laws restricted activities on Sundays. Many immigrants didn't like these and saw them as a violation of personal freedom. And you're going to start to see the question of alcohol comes up. Questions of regulation of liquor became an issue between evangelical and Christians and immigrants as well, because a lot of immigrants viewed the anti-alcohol bias as being against immigrants, which in some ways was true for some people. Blue laws are interesting because you actually see in our country, there are still some places where blue laws are on the books and in fact, over the past several years, we've seen some changes in some of these blue laws. So, for example, 10 years ago, when I started teaching at Sand River, where a lot of people do hunting there was still a blue law on the book here in Virginia that said that people could not hunt. So whenever I would talk about blue laws, people would bring up like, oh, we can't hunt on Sundays. That goes back to the old blue laws. I would say it's within the past 10 years, the ABC stores that sell alcohol, they have started opening on Sundays. And again, that went back to an old blue law that certain types of alcohol cannot be sold on Sundays. So some of these blue laws are still on the book and are still in the process of being changed. Organizational parties, you're going to see the parties during this time very, very well organized. They come up with these well organized structures. You can read what the structure is there. You would have national committees formed, both on the county, the state, and the federal level, and then conventions as well, which conventions are still a big part of the parties today as well. Party leadership. We talked about last class about the party machines and what party machines were willing to do during this time. Again, they were willing to do certain functions of that in exchange for public jobs and were often within the cities. And we talked about how they helped out immigrants within the cities, and machines weren't, again, necessarily bad as they produced politicians with experience in the nature of politics. Basically, they knew how to play the game. I mentioned Boss Tweed. He is right there, and you can see that's supposed to be his hand there as well in that political cartoon. Again, here's some more cartoons here showing the whole idea of Boss Tweed and even Dr. Seuss later on, 1941, the idea of Tammany Hall. Now, mugwumps. You're going to see a lot of the social elite during this time would resent political machines because it excluded the elite. If you think about the political machine didn't have any sway over the elite because the elite had what they needed. Political machines would be more influential with the lower classes of society that they could actually help and provide for. So some had actually left the GOP in 1872 in response to Grant's election. And you're going to see there would be this charge to leave the Republican Party again. They would actually support the Democratic governor, Democratic Grover Cleveland in the election, possibly helping him win. So basically, what the mugwumps was this group of wealthy people who wanted to have more influence and say in politics during that time. And what the term mugwumps actually refers to is a pompous or self-important person, which is how a lot of people view them. But again, this idea that the social elite said, hey, we want to have influence on politics as well, and it's a pushback against the political machines of the day. So what would be response to the mugwumps? You're going to see enthusiasm for reform spilling into local politics. politics, although they did inject an elitist bias into some political opinion. A lot of times you're going to see these mugwumps didn't really care for the working people and believe that the government was best, that governed least. Northern states, they would start to put in place literacy tests and limit the voting rights of immigrants. Again, going back to, we talked about how political machines often helped out immigrants, but they wanted votes in response to that. You would also see the start of the secret ballot here in the United States, something that had been imported in from Australia. And this limited power of not just political machines, but also the power of groups like the mugwumps. If you think about previous to this, before you had a secret ballot, pretty much everybody knew how you voted, and that could control a lot about how you might act in society. So, yeah. Women in politics. Politics, again, continued to be dominated by men and was associated with manliness. Why was it associated with that? Because it was competitive, it dealt with power, self-aggrandizing, and people just considered politics manly. Still, on the backside, you're going to have women pushing for suffrage. Female suffragists would reunite. Remember, we talked about how they split after the Civil War and after African Americans got the right to vote, and they would move back together and form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Susan B. Anthony would be the one to push to get that started. And they kind of changed and shift their focus. Their focus becomes on working in the state level first, and then hopefully to get enough states on board with giving women the right to vote, or just doing it within that state, and then bringing change to the federal government. Opponents of women's suffrage were, again, quick to move towards that separate spheres. Remember, we talked about how the idea of a separate sphere is that a woman's sphere was within the home. You'll see here, I like this response here from Ms. Dorr, who says, women's place is home, but home is not contained within the four walls of the individual house. Home is the community. The city full of people is the family, and badly do the home and family need their mother. So saying, hey, separate sphere isn't the home. Separate sphere is the whole city there. Women started to make their own political sphere during this time by fighting prostitution, trying to help out the poor, pushing for prison reform, and demanding better educational and job opportunities. So again, as we talked about, starting way back with the Second Great Awakening, women really pushing and taking the lead in these social movements, they would continue to do that during this time. You would also have, again, another thing partnered with this idea of women's suffrage would be the idea of temperance. And you'd have the Women's Christian Temperance Union get started under Frances Willard, and it was one of the country's leading women's organizations, and home protection was her motto. Their goals were, again, to make women into a political force and to push for the prohibition of alcohol, because they said alcohol had a detrimental effect on family. Carrie Ann Nation, again, I would encourage you to check her out. She is an interesting character. She lived in Kansas. She would often raid saloons and smash barrels of beer with a hatchet. There's some really cool pictures of her with like a hatchet that she would use to go into these saloons and smash barrels of beer. So in the 1880s, you would see the creation of the Prohibition Party. This party would not be successful, as many third parties in U.S. history have not been successful. It had very radical ideas for that time. Again, people weren't ready for prohibition. And the two major parties, another reason it would fail is that the two major parties were not as anti-female as suggested. Republicans, they are the ones that pushed evangelical reforms. They were often favored by women, and they had actually used the motto home protection. So really, you can see the Prohibition Party didn't work out well because the Republican Party started to take on a lot of the views of the Prohibition Party. Maybe at this time they weren't pushing for temperance to the extreme that the Prohibition Party was, but they were pushing for ideals that the Prohibition Party had. So what would be the influence of the Women's Christian Temperance Union? Willard would inadvertently contribute to the expanding role of women in politics. The Republicans would start recruiting female operatives from the WCTU to go out there. Even though the Republican Party as a whole was still against prohibition and women's suffrage, they started using these women in the field to help promote the Republican Party. Now, again, you'll see this more of a link now between women's social concerns and political participation. And this shows that women could be a force in the public arena as well. So again, showing that women could be involved in politics and do it well. I love this picture down here at the bottom here, the women holding up the sign that says, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Okay. Here we go. Where is this? All right, so we are to the end here of Gilded Age politics, and we're going to jump more into that and specifically focus on politics as a whole. But you can see, again, kind of sum up this area. This time, Congress was in control. Even though politics was kind of boring, people did have a lot of interest in it. And you are going to see women grow during this time as far as their role in politics. And a lot of people start seeing that women are more and more capable. And again, by this point, when you get to about 1890, we're only about 30 years away from women finally getting the right to vote in this country. So hope you enjoyed this and have a great day.